You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. You are listening to Nasim Ahmed. I am your host today for our conversation with Professor Lara Sheehi. We are turning our attention to the deliberate targeting and persecution of pro-Palestinian academics. Many have become victims of this McCarthyite witch hunt. Norman Finkelstein, Professor Cornel West, David Miller in the UK, Stephen Salaita in the US, Palestinian lecturer here in the UK, Shahad Abu Salma, are just some of the names that you may be familiar with. American professor Lara Sheehi is the most recent to be subjected to bullying and intimidation. I am thrilled that she has been able to join us today to speak about the smear campaign launched against her by a pro-Israeli organization called Stand With Us. We'll get to Stand With Us a bit later. I want to first welcome Lara and say how delighted I am to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Nasim, and thank you for all the work that you all do. And I follow your podcast quite closely, so it's an honor to be here today with you.
Thank you so much. Lara is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at George Washington University's professional psychology program, where she is the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab. Lara's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis with a focus on liberation struggles in Global South. She is the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, Routledge 2022, published last year. It won the 2022 Middle East Monitor's Palestine Book Awards for Best Academic Book. So that's when we met first, and then it was real to see you both at the Palestine Book Awards only a few months ago. Mm-hmm. I think it would be extremely valuable for our viewers to hear about the work you do. I think we'll explain the background to why you were targeted. You are assistant professor of clinical psychology, as I said, at Georgetown. What does your work entail?
Right. So at George Washington, I wear a couple hats. So primarily, I teach and train clinical psychologists who are in a doctorate program. So there's a lot of technique that I teach. I teach particularly systems of oppression and the ways in those get lodged within us, and how, as a part of being an ethical clinician, that we have to sort of trouble these identifications that we have with larger structures that create the conditions for suffering. So that's number one, the training part of my hat. I'm also a scholar, and my scholarship, as you noted, is about decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis. Specifically, what that means in brief is that I am a scholar of race particularly, and so I look at the ways in which our field generates sort of these larger white supremacist approaches to working, and our responsibilities to disrupt that. If we're to think historically about a Eurocentric psychoanalysis, a psychoanalysis that writes certain people and certain subjects and certain bodies out of history, whether they're gendered, raced, or classed. And so the other part of my scholarship is being a critical scholar of our field. And so a lot of what I do is look at the ideological tenets and underpinnings of our field and the ways in which those end up finding their way into our clinical spaces. But the overarching aspect of my scholarship is a real attention and pressure put on us to take responsibility for the suffering we might cause if we don't sustain a systemic analysis about what causes suffering, whether that's capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, poverty, all the things that might create suffering, and not locate symptoms or pathology in individuals. So that's sort of like the Cliff Notes version of what I do.
Yeah. So we will talk a little bit more about your course itself and how that's been impacted by a lot of what's happening around Israel-Palestine and the crackdown on free speech, and how that's impacting on how your ability to teach, and also the ability of students who come through your course to express their emotions and express their reality in a way which is equal to them and honest to them. But before we get to that, I mean, walk us through what happened, because I mentioned Stand With Us. It's one of the many pro-Israeli organizations. It's been around for over 2 decades, I think. And like many of the other organizations, Canary Mission is probably more notorious. It has a blacklist of websites smearing BDS supporters and accuses students who support Palestine of being racist in an effort to, basically get them blacklisted or from ever having a career or job. So Stand With Us seems to be, part of that enablers of Israeli occupation and the apartheid system in the US and also here in the UK. So walk through what happened and why With Us made the complaint that it did with the education department, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for allowing me the space to sort of walk you through the facts versus how Stand With Us presents them, which I think is a big part of this, is the ways in which, organizations like Stand With Us, like Canary Mission, the ones that you listed, work to create salacious narratives that activate certain tropes, particularly around issues of Palestine and then, of course, Arabness, to suggest and to consciously or unconsciously lead people to think that somebody is anti-Semitic by virtue of being pro-Palestine or working for Palestinian liberation. And in my case, by being an Arab, sort of positioning people to have to, as a precondition to anything, prove that you're not anti-Semitic. Their version of that is that nothing will work unless you give up your position around anti-Zionism. And that is really at the heart of this, is a sort of definition around what constitutes anti-Semitism, and nothing will work unless you say that, the sort of Zionist project, the settler colonial Zionist project is a valid one, and one that and then you give up your sort of ability to critically engage and push for Palestinian liberation and self-determination. So that is the beginning point of all this. And of course, I was aware of Stand With Us. Any of those of us who work within the context of Palestine and have for years, my whole life has been dedicated to the Palestinian cause as a Lebanese person, as somebody who believes in pan-Arab liberation. These organizations are not new to me. I think the piece that overlaps with the scholarship piece is that because I work on systems of oppression and because I implicate clinical psychologists in this, that is where Palestine, that's the Palestine overlap, is that I believe we have a ethical obligation to speak about modes of oppression that are caused by conditions, as I was saying, settler colonialism, whether it's settler colonialism in the state now known as Israel or the state now known as the United States, in which I live and I'm a settler here, or in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, so on and so forth. So there's a commitment to a larger study of this. And I'm not the first one, of course. The USA Palestine Mental Health Network works on this very closely, and many people across the world, whether in South Africa or in India, are working on this. So I just want to name that this is like part of what these organizations do, is make you seem, and in this case, me seem like I'm an outlier, right? Like I'm doing something so outside the norm. And I think that is part of what we need to do in speaking about this, is say that by and large, this is an accepted academic norm that we can speak about and criticize state policies, and particularly state policies that fit under the rubric of settler colonialism or apartheid, as in the case of Israel. When you speak about these things, you make yourself a target. And then when you're Arab as well, over top of it, it's an easy target, particularly in the context of the United States, because it already comes loaded. And so in this particular case, what Stand With Us did is work backwards from I was teaching a course at George Washington University in the fall, a course that I've taught for many years and which has never been problematic or contested on any level. And during the course of the semester, we had a brown bag event. And a brown bag, for those who might not be, aware of academic language, is just an event that's supposed to be informal. Brown bag meaning you bring your lunch, right? These are events that we do all the time. And so there are a variety of events we do, usually to take up parts of the curriculum that are underrepresented. And sometimes our students are the ones who are like, I want to learn more about this. I want to learn more about this. If it can't fit into our regular schedule, we do it as a brown bag. The important thing about the brown bag, why I'm making a point of this, is these brown bags are voluntary. They're not mandatory. They are not part of somebody having to get your degree. You must attend these things. And so one of the brown bags in the course of the fall semester, which happened on September 30th, was a brown bag in which Nadira Shalhoub-Kavrkian spoke about, just sort of paraphrasing very quickly, spoke about our responsibility as clinical psychologists to not mental health wash any state propaganda machine. So she used Israeli sources and talked about the ways in which these Israeli academics had found that Israel as a state had been using this sort of propaganda to intervene in places of crisis. And her example was Africa. And then she was sort of extrapolating it and saying, let's be aware of the ways in which states work to further their aims. By the way, this can be extended, and she said this, USAID in Haiti, or the ways in which Afghanistan, right? You come and you sort of set up this air of help, but we're also, as clinicians, have to trouble this idea of saviorism. And that's what she was talking about. And that is the event which Stand With Us primarily focuses around. But instead, because they don't have an argument there, right? It was voluntary. It was an academic talk. It was supplied by Israeli sources. What they have to do is then make links. And they're if you read the complaint, it's a very poorly written, very sloppy, completely bringing in, anecdotal information that any of us reading, and many people who did, were just like, this is ridiculous. But the problem is that they team up with right-wing media sources in the context of the United States, and they make a story that then sticks. The reason why it sticks is because we have anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and Islamophobic sentiment that is very easy to access. And so I received word of this filing with the Department of Education the day before it was actually filed. And that tells us everything we need to know, that it was released to a right-wing news source before it was even filed with the Department of Education, which is anybody can file with the Department of Education. But the fact that you're releasing it to a right-wing news source is because that machine is well-oiled. And that was the sort of kickoff event of this. And the complaint collapses the brown bag, my scholarship and activism around Palestine, with what they insist must have happened in the classroom and in relationship to my students. And that false claim, that allegation, the dangerous allegation, is that because of all these things, I must have therefore retaliated against my Jewish students. And so they also collapsed Jewishness. So they made it seem like all Jewish students are now subjected to retaliation and aggression from me based on all these things. Of course, again, if you read the complaint, there is no proof of that, but it certainly took hold, and it took a life of its own.
Yeah, and it's quite a typical common playbook that's used, in the smear campaign. I mean, you were accused of demonizing Israel, making this Jewish student cry, and a number of other things. Of course, the anti-Semitism word also came into it as well. And really, I think they feel, from my experience, I've mentioned a number of names at the beginning: Finkelstein, David Miller in the UK, so many others, and I think there's a sense that they feel empowered to be able to do these campaigns, smear campaigns, and just get away with it. And because the bar is so low, all you have to do is make noise, and there's no consequences for that. Universities feel compelled to investigate, which is what happened in your case. But thankfully, as we will get to, you were cleared of any of the allegations that were made against you. So what were some of the tactics that were used by Stand With Us in terms of your case? What did they do? I think there was a recording which would probably vindicate everything that you said, and probably show that they have been misleading or misinforming everyone. So what was it that they did?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you're also bringing up other people, because I think this shows a pattern of harassment, which is one of the tactics. The tactic is to harass and try and kick up as much dirt and cloudiness as possible. On the one hand, they do act with impunity, and that is part of what you're saying. On the other hand, we know there are countless of these cases that don't make it to be that big, which is why they have to cast out this large net, and which is why, honestly, only the right-wing media is willing to work with them. Stand With Us is known as one of the most right-wing pro-Israel groups, even though they say they are nonpartisan, so much so that they work with the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and they believe that settlements are not illegal. I mean, that is a pretty right-wing stance. That is not a mainstream, even soft Zionist stance about settlements. That's a pretty easy thing to take a position on, right? But they are extremely right-wing. So one of it is a campaign of harassment or astroturfing. So you're just constantly trying to flood and make a story. Now, when you look at this, when I've known this before, and then when it's me at the center, you sort of get a little bit of firsthand information about this. It ends up looking like there are so many people that are writing about this. But what we saw immediately is that there's a handful, maybe 3 or 4, honestly, right-wing news sources with one journalist, I'm putting it in air quotes, that are dedicated to this. And they just keep reproducing the same story over and over again. And they take each other's stories and print them. So there's already a network there. This is not a conspiracy, folks. This is the way that propaganda works, right? What we also saw were a multitude of bots, or a sort of AI-generated commentary that floods GW, social media, anything that's positive about me, like the letters of support that came out, or any facts get flooded with the same sort of tag. And so they try to generate a sort of trend to make something trend on social media, right? Another version, like you said, is Stand With Us is known to have interns starting in high school, which is terrifying. And now they're also moving into middle school. These sorts of things in which they come and they train students how to audio tape and videotape classrooms in order to frame or walk people into these controversies, right? And their criteria, as you said, is very low bar. Any sort of criticism of the state of Israel for them constitutes anti-Semitism. So even if you're in a political science class that's talking about settler colonialism or apartheid, that would be the classrooms that they train students in. Sometimes the students aren't even part of the classroom. They are sent into classrooms on a mission, so to speak, to do this. And in one way, I want to say that because that is a tactic also that even when it doesn't happen in the context of the United States, professors are always under the sort of knowledge that this is an imminent threat. And so we can think about the ways in which this happens to silence, to intimidate, and to stop people from even talking to begin with. And so you end up having to do all these sorts of things of rewiring your syllabus, writing things out of history, because people are worried that this will happen. Of course, if they're untenured, it becomes even more worrisome to them. It came out after the fact that one of the students in my class used to be an intern with Stand With Us. And so one of the questions people kept asking me was, did you think this was a setup? And that would be nothing I would ever think to begin with. That would never be the intent or sort of way that I would walk into a classroom, assuming because that in and of itself is racist. That is the assumption that's made about me always. So that was never a thought in my mind. And I think the most tragic thing out of all of this is now I look back and I go, I wonder if this was a setup from the beginning, because we know that these organizations keep a list of professors. They work in concert with these right-wing organizations like the Horowitz Freedom Foundation, like Canary Mission, who happen to also, and I'm using this facetiously, just by chance, update my Canary Mission profile at the same time that these sorts of big news, pieces hit the right-wing blogosphere, right? So it's on lockdown, and I think these are the ways that people do this. The recording you're talking about is when you read the complaint, it reads like somebody is directly quoting somebody. You know how sometimes you see the difference between a paraphrase and a direct quote. There are several direct quotes. And so when what's that?
You will know your words, how you
Oh, absolutely. I know how I talk, and that sort of, phrasing that you might do as you talk versus when you write something, right? So when I finally wrote my response piece to all of this, that was the challenge, is let's release that recording. Number one, this is unethical, in especially in the context of DC, but also this is a clinical psychology program. We have a code of ethics that we are beholden to that go beyond a layperson's code of ethics. We talk about clinical material in those classrooms. People share their own personal lives. This is considered confidential material. So there are many layers of unethical behavior that go into this. So of course, Stand With Us is not going to release that, not only because it doesn't fit their narrative, but also because it's a real ethical concern.
Yeah. And one thing which a lot of people don't realize, they probably look at this and think, oh, these are just civil society organizations, individuals in a battle of with each other. But really, for me, a realization that helps is the fact that there are top-down civil society groups and bottom-up civil society groups, and Stand With Us is a top-down civil society groups which embedded in a system of oppression supporting Israel, and it has resources which you and I can never imagine. We are, of us are bottom-up civil society organizations. We can only count on our solidarity, and which is why they can get away with saying things like this, because there's no consequences. There's always someone that can bail them out, even if they were to make things up. Because you and I, we cannot do things like this. Turning attention to George Washington, your university, do you feel you were let down? Should they have allowed the investigation and independent investigation to be opened, which of course cleared you in the end, but do you feel, they should have taken it that far?
Yeah. I think there are multiple layers to this. So I am exceedingly grateful that I am one of few people in which the investigation is this unequivocally in my favor, a third-party investigation. Part of why I felt let down is because we know that often this is not the case, is not the way that it, even though truth is on our side, or someone like Stephen Salaita ended up getting the ruling was to his favor, but after what, right? After being entirely derailed from his career, he gets a ruling in his favor. Rabab Abdelhadi, who is ruling after ruling in her favor, but at what cost, right? So I think that's the piece that's very disappointing, is that, and also matches the tactics and the pressure campaign that these sorts of organizations, that's what you're talking about, top down, is the pressure campaign, the dedicated labor that is put into this, right? Not because of they think this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy. It's not. It's just, this is a propaganda campaign, and good propaganda does that, right? So that is the sort of labor that goes into this. So, the Jewish Voice for Peace Healthcare Advisory Council wrote a letter on my behalf. And one of the things they said in there as Jewish Voice for Peace is their concern that more and more universities are caving to this pressure because it is so sustained and it is so unbending that universities end up feeling like we need to do this, if nothing else, to show that we did a good faith effort in investigating this. The letdown on my part, and why I felt like The Guardian wrote a piece about this in which I had said that I feel like the university is colluding with these right-wing organizations, because these allegations were already adjudicated on the part of my program and then on the part of the deans. So twice over, then an outside consultant was brought in. So many steps had already been taken in the fall semester to attend in earnestness to any concerns, which I would hope would be the case for any students. We know it often is not, but I hope that would be the case for any student. So 3 times over, this was attended to, and I was found without fault. And then the Stand With Us campaign hits, and the GW was in possession of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents that would have allowed them to stand behind their professor and say, we will go forward with the Department of Education if the Department of Education happens to ask us, but we stand by our professor. That part did not happen. What we also know is that a Palestine exception was shown, is that they moved with a third-party investigator on this case. 1 month later, Palestine Legal filed a Title VI complaint on behalf of 3 students with actionable items because those had already been shown, publicized, one of which was denying mental health access to Palestinians. That was in the public already. And they didn't hire a third-party investigator. So there are many places of disappointment. So on the one hand, I understand the pressure that universities are under, and that is why it's an issue of academic freedom and why we all have to speak really loudly about it, because we understand why universities cave. In my case, because the documentation was so comprehensive, this third-party investigator that was retained by GW, which Stand With Us loved at the beginning, because this is the other tactic. Anything is proof of guilt. When GW caved to their pressure and hired a third-party investigator before the Department of Education, right? So they preempted the Department of Education. Stand With Us was all over the place being like, see, this is proof of, this is a win. This is proof of her guilt. Anything can be spun in their direction. This was a 3-month comprehensive investigation at a time when universities are not spending money on anything. And so you can see coming from the presidential level. So they were sort of alerting the world, this is important enough to rise to this level in a time where we're spending money on nothing else. So that's the other part, is that ends up, in so many words, throws me to the wolves, because in the public eye, it looks like you're worried. That's why you're doing this. And you're worried because this Arab is, as a precondition, an anti-Semite. What ended up happening after this comprehensive investigation, again, third-party, impartial, by an internationally renowned agency, a law firm that also has an Israel practice in it, that also has anti-boycott legislation practices within it. So this is not biased in my favor, right? After 3 extensive months of interviews with students who were in that classroom, who attended the brown bag, faculty, deans, administrators, it found me unequivocally without fault. It found that I did not engage in retaliation. I did not engage in any systemic negation of any Jewish student's identity. It also found that Stand With Us's complaint was largely based on untruths, decontextualized information, and embellishments. And that, for us, for the first time ever in terms of the Palestine movement, we have a legal document that indicates exactly what you have been saying about how these organizations work. That document also noted that if we are to equate the critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism, we would be limiting academic freedom. So, of course, Stand With Us is not happy with this unequivocal result. And the new campaign is that this was GW's counsel, that this was a sham investigation. Why didn't they release the result? 3 months before, they were celebrating. Now this is a sham and these results are not real, because they were primed to believe, and they primed everybody else to believe, that I would be found with fault. And that is the sort of hypocrisy we're saying. It doesn't matter that a legal organization found me without fault. They are still insistent, because the premise never included facts. It included an ideological position.
Which is exactly what the allegations, anti-Semitism allegation that's been thrown around and directed at you is claiming. It's based on a faulty definition of anti-Semitism, which is, the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which equates criticism of Israel with anti-Jewish racism. And that really goes to the heart of what this is about, trying to conflate anti-Jewish racism, which we all opposed to, everyone is opposed to, with criticism of Israel, shielding Israel from any kind of criticism. And I think that your case is really a microcosm of what's happening outside the university. There's victory in your case, but in so many other cases, even though in the case of, say, for example, David Millett here in the UK, even though he was found to have not committed anti-Semitism, he still had to leave his job. Many others have also been forced out of their job, even though they've been vindicated and not been found anti-Semitic. So I want to just if you can speak to the broader issue of how IHRA is being used, because you educate people on structural racism. You are probably better placed than most to understand how such targeting is really the modus operandi of an oppressive system. Pro-Palestinian voices. There was a case of the Arkansas's Jewish person who basically he lost £500 because he would not make a pledge not to boycott Israel. So there's all these spaces in our society, in our communities, where IHRA is having such a vindictive, nefarious impact on our society. The best person to explain how this is used to suppress pro-Palestinian activism.
Yes, yeah, of course. And of course, most recently, University of Denver, Professor Nader Hashim. And again, it's over and over and over again. And that's why it's structural, because it's not a one-off. And the pattern is exactly the same. The playbook is exactly the same. And that's what Jewish Voice for Peace we're also saying is, we see this playbook. We know the playbook of what it is. And this is the part that gets collapsed. And here I lean on always, not only just those who I learn alongside and my academic credentials, which I commit myself to a rigor of academia that would show that these collapses are specious at best, but like you said, also dangerous because they elide and completely misrepresent what the true danger is when we're talking about anti-Semitism, right? At the time when fascism and neo-Nazism is rampant in the world, I want to join alongside my Jewish siblings in fighting that, right? Not covering for a state that should be treated like every other state. Every other state. I have a Jewish colleague of mine who has a pretty popular show, and she said on her show when she was interviewing me that in her experience as a Jewish person, the only two factions that collapse all Jewishness with the state of Israel are Zionists or fascists. Yeah. And that is what the IHRA does for us. It puts us in this position in which we might unwittingly engage in anti-Semitic tropes by sort of tasking every Jewish person in the world with the policies and violences of the state of Israel. I refuse to do that, right? It also is very disturbing, and this is what a lot of scholars have said, that the IHRA definition, I think it's something like 7 out of 10 of the examples have to do with the state of Israel.
7 out of 11, yes.
Exactly. And so there's something there that alerts us to an ideological process that's happening. And that ideological process is meant to stifle, intimidate, and curate a particular type of discourse that then becomes, like you said, a sort of facts on the ground, right? And I think there are ways in which many very important organizations are not on board with this. The Department of Education rejected this because they understand that no other situation or category rises to this level. So why would they make an exception? Of course, we know human rights organizations, the American Bar Association, all of these, we're seeing this just in the last year, people saying, we see now the dangers of this and we reject this. Now, of course, we know that what propaganda machines do is when those, let's say, more respectable modes of enshrining a definition don't work, what happens is they ramp up in the other modes that then intimidate, harass, make campaigns. And so they do so to sign, how dare you speak about this? I don't, and the propaganda machine is like, I don't care about these reputable sources. I care about silencing you because I recognize that this is dangerous. That's why Stand With Us has branches now in the UK, in South Africa. They just opened up a branch. And that's why billions of dollars go into anti-BDS campaigns. If BDS were so lowly, why are you expending this much money on it, right? That is what alerts us to the structural nature of it. It's actually their tactics that show us, oh, there's something actually here that you are very worried about. And you need to change the discourse about it. And I want to say it's not working. It's really not working.
You know, over the last decade or so, since BDS was launched in 2005, there's been a proliferation of top-down civil society organizations. And Stand With Us, supported by Israel, of course, in a top-down civil society organization, which all come to Israel's aid. And Stand With Us is just one of their many top-down organizations. And then the IHRA issue, I mean, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, Zionism is not Judaism.
Right.
And most Jews are not, I mean, sections of the Jewish community are not Zionist.
That's right.
And in terms of numbers, most Zionists are Christian Zionism. In terms of numbers,
Especially in the United States.
Yeah, so on every count, I mean, you can see how it's the IHRA which is guilty of, conflating Israel with all Jews, which is really not the case.
Yes. Yes.
We are running out of time, so I want to ask you before we finish, just how this has impacted on students you teach that come through your course. As we know, language is important for students, especially people who come from oppressed background, to be able to express themselves and speak about them in a way to be able to freely do that. So, in the case of Palestine, we can see more and more how language is becoming criminalized or questioned as being anti-Semitic. So how is that affecting Palestinians and pro-Palestinian students who are coming through your class and not able to speak about the oppression and the injustices they feel?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, because you're sort of talking about the chilling effects of this. What I will say is, by and large, our students, because of their training, are trained to sort of think about logics and oppression as structural, not as individual. And so I think what has happened, from what I understand, and these sorts of things limit my ability to be available to my students. And that's the tragic part of it, because I cannot and will not isolate students, regardless of and especially if students feel no matter how not true that I've aggressed upon them, I will not isolate them. And so one of the tragic things about this is I was one of few people of color on the faculty, and my students have lost somebody they can speak to, because this sort of stuff limits my ability to do that in a particular type of way. So that's one. What I will say, though, is that because we live in a world now where we understand about how cross-solidarity movements work, I've also seen students organize, come together, recognize what's happening in real time. There was a letter signed by hundreds of students that witnessed and said this is not how it went down, including Jewish students who felt like their identity was being collapsed and words were being put in their mouth in the public eye, because this was a few students and their perspective was applied to everybody else. And so on some level, I think we're in an age and time now where students refuse to not speak up. Because the students also, my students, link this up with their clinical response and ethical responsibilities as clinicians. They're saying, how can we be ethical and not talk about all the multiple ways that oppression happens, whether that's at the hands of anti-Semitism, at the hands of fat phobia, at the hands of queer phobia, transphobia, classism, and settler colonialism. So in many ways, they don't have a problem seeing how these things match up, but they are very much concerned, and they're very worried about me leaving, me being silenced. And I think that is why doing this sort of thing is really important, is to say that, you know, if the aim is to silence us and to make it feel like Palestinians or pro-Palestinian activists or our Black siblings or our Asian siblings don't belong in these conversations, part of it is speaking out and saying, we refuse that. We refuse to stop talking about these issues just because these right-wing organizations are creating a space of hostility for us. But we're doing that communally. We're doing that globally. We can't do that alone, right? So it's a both and. There is a sincere concern about what happens to me now. Many students from across the world, not just from my own program, are like, if this can happen to you, what about me, right? Yeah. And so there is that fear. It's chilling. And also a recognition of, I see how this happens. And that makes my responsibility even greater to speak about, for all the people, like you said, that the people who lost their jobs, but people who didn't even make it into jobs because of this. I've gotten so many emails from people in Germany, from people in the UK, from people all over the world that said, I didn't even get a job because I speak about Palestine. And so there's this sort of double consciousness that's happening around this.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we pro-Palestinian activists, those exposing oppression, are the ones who are cancelled the most. I think the right wings do
the only time cancellation works.
Sadly, the attack on you is not going to be the last. There will be more and more who will suffer, you know, these vicious smear campaigns. I think it's an indication of how desperate Israel is becoming as more and more organizations show the apartheid nature of Israel. I think it's just lashing out, you know, over the place, and that's really how it's behaving. And you are a victim of that, as are many others. We have come to the end of our time, you know, so I want to really thank you and really appreciate you speaking to us and giving us the time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I want to thank those who have joined or listened through the podcast, and hope to speak to you again soon in another MEMO conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Nassim. I really appreciate it.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.